Hi, Gary Stearman. Let's talk about the Greek language of the New Testament. We have a very special guest. His name is Brent Miller Sr. of One Path Publishing. And if you have seen him in the past, you know that he's occupied with the truth about what the Bible really says. And I want you to watch a promotional that he recently made. And after that, we're going to introduce him to you once again and discuss the Greek language of the New Testament.
When Jesus spoke, he spoke in the common man's language, Koine Greek, which is a very precise and elegant language. English, on the other hand, is a very imprecise language. We now have over 450 translations in English that have subtle changes with each other. These subtle changes create discrepancies which create division among Christians. So how do you solve the problem? What if we could go back to translate the entire New Testament and understood it exactly the way the early Christian church understood it 2,000 years ago? Only recently, with breakthroughs in a monadic hermeneutics-based translation, have we been able to accomplish translating the entire New Testament in just over 20 years. It opens up your eyes to the true nature of God. For example, in Greek, we have 4 words for love. There is the physical love, there is a brotherly love, there is a perfect God love, pure and holy. And then there's the bonding of a mother with a child. In English, all these words are translated into a single word, love. But in the original language, there are 4 very precise words. So if you look at John at chapter 21, where Jesus is asking Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter's response is, "Yes, Lord, I love you." In English, we see the same word. In Greek, Jesus is asking Peter, "Do you agape me? Do you love me unselfishly?" Peter's response is, "I love you," but the word he uses is phileo. "I have brotherly love for you." So in the end, because Peter could not raise himself up to God's standard, God love, Jesus came down to Peter's level and says, "Do you love me?" But in the third question to Peter, it was, "Do you phileo me?" So, of course, Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, I phileo you." So why is it that Peter couldn't agape love Jesus? You'll remember that previously, before Jesus' crucifixion, Peter denied Christ 3 times. So Peter realizes how flawed he is, showing us that God comes down to our level, where we are at, to save us. If you read your English Bible, reading that passage, you will see the word love 6 times. But you will have lost the meaning, the depth that Christ is trying to show you. The pure word shows you every single original definition in the translation and what God fully intended. Receive the full meaning and blessing that Christ always meant for us to have.
Well, I hope that was illustrative of the subject on our minds today. Brent Miller Sr., good to have you back.
It's good to be back.
And we're going to talk about the Bible. And you have spent how many hours in Bible translation?
Tens of thousands, more than we've counted. Essentially, the last 25 years, 22 years totally dedicated for the creation of the pure word translation. You know, to recap, the translation provides the original depth of meaning with the parsings that the early church and apostles wrote 2,000 years ago. Language over hundreds of years have changed. Definitions have changed. Meanings of words have changed. So what you have is hundreds of different versions of the Bible today that essentially say different things. It creates division among the church, and
Now,
these divisions can be easily resolved when you refer back to the original Greek, which is what we've done.
I want to pick up where we left off on our last broadcast. We were talking about Revelation 13:15 and what it says about the Antichrist system when you really closely examine the Greek language. And where do you want to go from there? Because we spent a lot of time talking about that, which I think was really interesting. Actually, what the Bible is talking about in Revelation is what we see happening today.
It is happening today. What we see in Revelation 13:15 is the Apostle John, he sees a system where the image of the beast is actually a communication device which connects the individual through an unknown language, which he uses the word to utter, which is to utter in a unintelligible language, to a system which connects people to their finances. And if they're not part of this system, they will not be connected to their finances. In other words, they will not be able to buy or sell. This is what the scriptures have told us will happen, and this is what we see happening around the world. We are connected to the system right now, even though we are not in allegiance with the system, the Antichrist system. It will be given to him, and we won't be able to buy or sell until we agree to support the Antichrist and the new global society that will be set up for sustainability.
Yeah, to pick up where we left off last time, things are changing invisibly right now. I know you held up your communications device last time, which we variously call C-phone, or what are all the names? It started out with flip phones, but now when you hold up that thing, it's not just a phone anymore. It's a communication device, and it speaks a language.
Correct.
A language that's understood by computers globally. And much to our dismay, a global system is being set up that watches us. It's going to be very soon capable of watching us everywhere we go, 24/7. It recognizing our face, recognizing our actions, and so forth. And you mentioned also that when it comes to buying and selling, most of us already are cashless.
Right.
You know, we carry our devices and our cards and whatever else we have, and cash is being phased out not by executive fiat, but just by everyday usage. So the system is in place, and let's just pick up that conversation and take it to the next level.
Okay. Yeah, we talked about the technology of the system where you won't be able to buy or sell. And that is actually scary because the reason it's scary is because it's happening today. It takes decades to set this up. And this system will be handed to the Antichrist to control. So if you want access to your money, you have to be part of the new system that is going to be enforced. But there's even more technology which is scarier that is happening today around the world that the Antichrist will have access to. And this is technology that should make every American afraid. Christian and non-Christian alike, because it affects every single one of us. And the scriptures talk about it, but it talks about it in a way that we could only understand it if we look at the original Greek definitions from the early church about 2,000 years ago. The technology that will be discussed by the Antichrist, well, before we even get there, let me ask you, what is the goal of the Antichrist to start with? What's his goal? He obviously doesn't serve God. He serves Lucifer. What is the goal of the Antichrist?
If I just had to put it in a few words, the goal of the Antichrist is global control. And to achieve that, he's got to control massive population groups. And in order to do that, thinning the population would help. Cutting out those who might be revolutionaries, who might be against him, cutting out those who you just don't considered to be good citizens in your new world order or whatever it is. But I think thinning out the population and getting everyone to be a firmly established follower of himself.
Gary, you're absolutely correct. The goal of the Antichrist is to create a world that is essentially utopia. It's heaven on earth, because the goal of the Antichrist is to have society, in essence, give allegiance to the Antichrist. So everything that Satan wishes to accomplish will set up a world that is sustainable and that is loyal to him and that is, in his eyes, deemed to be a perfect society. Now, before we get into the details of the technology, I just want to remind yourself, which you're very well aware of, and some of the listeners who may not be aware of it, history always repeats itself if we do not learn from history. Now, there are many people that don't believe that governments will turn on their own citizens because it's not advertised. But if you go to Wikipedia, you will see literally dozens and dozens of times of multiple countries all over the planet over the last several hundred years that literally turn on their own citizens. Genocide. Literally wiping out their own citizens that they are supposed to be protecting. Why? In order to make, quote, a better society.
Well, we have two good examples, Cuba and Venezuela, right now.
Yeah, that's happening now. Most people will recognize Hitler as being that type of person. They see Hitler, the word genocide comes to him. He killed and is responsible for the death of 43 million people, which includes 6 million Jews. Now, let's look at Hitler, and before I continue, I want to make it very clear and for the record that he was blinded by wickedness, and he was a very evil man, and nothing he believed or said was correct. But he wanted to wipe out the undesirable people, and he wanted to establish a new form of government, which included a government religion. But why? Now, this is the key. He wanted to purify the genetic makeup of the population to create a sustainable and perfect world. Doesn't that sound familiar?
Blonde-headed, blue-eyed Aryans wanted, he thought that they were superior beings, and in fact, he was very much, his doctors, including Mengele, experimenter with human genetics very primitively at that point in history, but it's much more evolved now. The genetic research has reached scary proportions.
Right.
And there's somebody out there who wants to emulate Hitler, even as we speak. And the Bible names him very clearly.
Yeah, you're right. You hit on the key point. One of the key points of Hitler's goal was genetic research, was to identify those people who would be surgically removed from society and those people who he deemed to be part of his new world order, the new society. I'm using the term world order loosely, of course. So they did do a lot of genetic experiments. And quite frankly, they used these genetic experiments in order to not just separate the Jews, but to separate other portions of the society that they deemed inappropriate. But let's move forward very quickly to the 21st century.
Okay.
What do we have in the 21st century? We have the ability to genetically determine at a very advanced level if a person is predisposed of certain diseases. For instance, I may be predisposed in the future of getting diabetes, or 20% of us are predisposed to get cancer. Would I then, if I was in one of those two categories, would I be chosen in a sustainable world? Not likely, because then I might develop these conditions.
Yeah. Along comes a director and says to you, we've discovered that your life expectancy is not all that much, and the state really, thank you very much, but we don't need you anymore, and you're out of here. So you're talking about a highly controlled society that is picking out only the best followers.
Yeah, exactly. Now let's look at what the scriptures say about the Antichrist and compare it to what Hitler's goals were. They're very similar but expanded. The goal of the Antichrist is to create a utopia on earth. In biblical prophecy, we are told in the last days that he will unite the world, He will be seen as the Messiah. He will enforce the mark of the beast, as we discussed earlier, not allowing people to buy or sell without being connected and giving allegiance to this new system. He will kill everyone that resists him. And most importantly, he promises us peace and safety. Now,
In fact, that's a good Bible quote.
yeah, it is.
When they cry out peace and safety.
Sudden destruction, will come.
And that really rings a bell.
Yeah, so the world, when he promises these things, they will think that he is ushering in, because he is incredibly brilliant, charismatic, and he is ushering in a new world of utopia. They, of course, want that. They want their problems to be solved, but they don't believe for 1 second that they will be part of the percentage that will be surgically removed that is undesirable for the new society. And this is where we come up with a new technology available for the Antichrist.
Now, let's just form a little junction here between the past and the future. You mentioned Hitler, and you mentioned that he attempted the things that the Antichrist will actually succeed at, because he will have a greater technology, a higher level of technology. And so, visualizing the Antichrist, you ask a question: what if Hitler had access to a global system of genetics, DNA analysis?
Oh my God. Can you imagine how horrifying that would be? If Hitler didn't have to just clump people, he could surgically say, this is the list of names, eliminate them. This is the list of people we want, move them into another camp. This is the keep camp, this is the destroy camp. He could, on a very, very quick process, eliminate all the people that he didn't want and save all the people he did want. Now, this brings us to goals of a sustainable world. And here the key is sustainable. What does sustainable mean to the Antichrist and what's coming up? We clearly know that the world is not sustainable. But at this point, because we are using more resources every year on this planet than the population gives back. Let's talk about the DNA, this DNA database that you mentioned that if Hitler had access to. You know, there are companies, we won't name the companies, but there are companies popping up where millions and millions of people every year are giving their DNA freely, openly to these databases.
It's almost a fad now. You have to send off and get your DNA history so you can discover who your ancient relatives were.
Who your ancestors are, right. And
yeah.
people are doing it and sharing it. But at the same time, these companies also do genetic profiling for traits based on your health and based on what you may have a propensity to have in the future. So these are going into worldwide massive databases that the governments have access to. Well, what is a database? It's a collection, a pool of information that you can quickly and easily extract lists from. You just simply give it the requirements of the list that you want, and it immediately pops out. Give me the list of everybody in LA that is a Christian, that has this propensity, or this, and it gives you the list. Now, in a sustainable world where we know the human population must be reduced, those lists would come in critical if you also wanted to create, in Hitler's own words, a genetically pure society.
And it's all happening so smoothly and so innocuously. It's now kind of a happy fad. It's something that if you've got a little spare time and a few extra bucks, hey, I'm going to get my DNA analyzed and find out who I am and what I am, and then I'm going to compare that with all my friends. And the first thing you know, everybody's doing it. But behind the scenes, I can really see a larger operation. All of that data can be amassed or sold, if you will. And again, I don't know all the details, but you're painting a pretty scary picture.
Yeah, it is scary. And in fact, it's not, a lot of times, it's not volunteered information. Some countries are requiring DNA submission now. In fact, recently, President Trump signed the Rapid DNA Collection Act in Arizona, which requires, under certain conditions, for a wide range of reasons, DNA is mandatory to be collected by individuals. Of course, there are reasons for it,
Yeah.
but that is only the beginning. Now, also, we live in, there are other technologies that are being in place that the Antichrist will use. For example, we live in the world's most free country. So everybody thinks that nothing will happen to Americans. But, so we see that the government has already decided that everybody by the October of 2020 has to have a real ID, for example. Well, or a passport if they want to travel on a domestic flight. Well, that doesn't seem to be an issue, except when you look at a real ID, you have to prove who you are with your birth certificate. You have to give them your social security number and prove that. And this is the key. You have to prove where you live. You can't just say it. You have to show proof documentation that you live where you say you live. Why would the government want that information and insist on having it accurate and have everybody in the country who is going to board a domestic flight have that available literally in just over a year? And I submit to you, this is only one, but a number of laws. Now that's this country, the most free country on earth. Let's talk about a few countries of data collection that will be used by the beast in order to end his goals. Let's look at India, for example. We know that recently India is requiring that every single one of its 1.1 billion citizens have biometric scanning and registered with the government, just so that the government can keep track of them. And this is the cool part. The government tells each of them that it is critical that they have this biometric scanning done, because the day will come, and these are the government's words, the day will come that unless you are registered and part of the system, you will not be able to buy or sell. The exact words that Revelation says the mark of the beast will enforce.
Now, the beast himself, and we, on our last program together, we talked about the actions of the beast, the Antichrist, and how closely, as described in the Bible, how closely they resemble modern data collection and control. And we looked at Revelation 13, 15, specifically in the pure word, which is a New Testament that you have worked on for many, many years now, in a way that I don't think anybody ever has before, translating the Greek into the actuality of its meaning, which doesn't make for a poetic translation, but it makes for a very clear translation. And in Revelation 13, you have an image, 13:15, you have an image, and this image is made to utter and might cause that whosoever might not have worshipped the beast or the image of the wild beast, they shall be killed. Now, we talked about that word utter, an unintelligible utterance, something you can't understand. And you know, that's what the governments have today. They operate at a level that not everybody can understand. They exchange information through computer data networks, and if you're just a common everyday citizen who doesn't have access to that high-tech communications, those utterances will just go right over your head. And you pointed out that this translation from the Greek indicated precisely that.
The word utter that John used, of 12 possible words he could use, he used the word that means that no human can understand the communication method. Mm-hmm. You know, and it is the image, the object, which does the uttering. But who does it utter to? It utters to the connecting system that will either allow you to buy or sell. And without being connected to the system or registered with the system or giving allegiance to the system, you will not be able to access your own funds, whether credit cards, debit accounts, your smartphones won't work. All you have to do is simply give allegiance to the system that will help and save you and bring in the new world order of peace and safety. Who wouldn't do that? But here's the key. In verse the very beginning of verse 15, Revelation 13:15, and it was made given to him, him being the Antichrist. In other words, this system is already in place. It exists. This is the system that is being formed and we're using.
You're saying the system is not constructed at that time. It already exists,
Right.
and then he gains control
He
of it.
gains control of it. So he uses technology that we have been using for years. It's just going to be used at a much more advanced level. For example, in order to enforce a cashless society, he has to remove the rest of the cash and enforce this electronic banking system. In order to do that effectively, just one point to show you how fast this world's moving. You have to have, if you want to be able to buy and sell from any place on the planet, and this is a requirement, then you have to have internet access, let's call it internet access, from any place on the planet. Interestingly enough, the FCC just granted a company, SpaceX, last year, the license to launch broadband satellites. They actually call it a constellation of broadband satellites which will orbit the Earth. This is interesting. There are 12,000 satellites scheduled to be launched. 12,000 satellites scheduled to be launched so that the entire globe is circled with internet access, broadband access. You can be in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the ocean, Amazon rainforest. You will have 12,000 satellites. FCC granted SpaceX that last year. They have already started launching satellites. So this is part of the technology, because once you have a system in place like this, you could easily enforce something that prevents them from buying or selling.
And let me just say that this all came to Brent while his group was going through the translation of what he's called the pure word. It's the New Testament, translated from the Greek in literal terms so that you can see what the Greek literally says at any point. And if you want a copy of this, we're making the leather-bound available to you for $85, the paperback for $50, and we're sending you a presentation made by Brent Miller on a DVD at our last prophecy conference. So if you want to hear more of what he has to say, you can see it on that DVD presentation. But Brent, we've got less than a minute to conclude a complex story.
Yeah. What I'd like to conclude with is this is not a time for Christians to fall asleep, to be awake and aware of what is happening around us, the technologies that are unfolding, and how the Antichrist will use them. In fact, this topic is so important that I am writing a new book called Forcing the Mark that'll be out later this year. And I would like to be back on the show to discuss that with you when that's available.
Yeah, and we do need, actually we haven't had nearly enough time today to talk about the breadth of the subject, but I appreciate your being here, and there will be a next time.
Thank you,
Brent
Gary.
Miller Sr. Of One Path Publishing, and he's constantly working on helping you understand the Bible. I'm Gary Stearman. Thanks for being with us, and keep watching, everybody. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter, or follow us at facebook.com/prophecywatchers. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.